And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Today we will talk about how the US's harsh tariff policy brought down one of the most iconic American companies, Ford. It would seem that the idea of protecting factories and bringing back jobs should have united the industry and given the economy a new boost.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
But what really happened? Factories shut down silently, thousands of workers found themselves out of work, and prices for new cars skyrocketed. You've heard about the tariffs that were supposed to make America great again, but no one said they would cause an unprecedented crisis in the auto industry.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
The story is full of dramatic twists and turns, from silent fear on the assembly lines of Detroit to panic-stricken meetings in the offices of the largest car companies. Behind the scenes, there was a struggle for survival, a rethinking of plans, and alarming signs that the American auto industry might never recover.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
And that's not all. Tariffs have not only ruined companies, but also caused the collapse of international contracts, the loss of key markets, and the disruption of complex supply chains built over decades. How will this tariff war end? Will American car factories be able to keep jobs, or will tariffs be the final nail in their coffin? Today, we dive into the details that the authorities have tried to hide, reveal the real consequences, and explain why the fate of Ford and the entire American auto industry is hanging in the balance right now. Stay tuned, this is a story you won't want to miss.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Over the past few years, the US auto industry has faced an unprecedented challenge caused by the tariff policy introduced by President Donald Trump. The main tool of this policy has been a 25% tariff on imported cars and parts that are not manufactured in the US. It seemed like a simple solution: stimulate domestic production, bring back jobs, and strengthen the national industry. However, in practice, this measure proved to be far more destructive than could have been imagined. The management of companies such as Ford has repeatedly spoken out against these tariffs, noting that their effect is more likely to harm the US economy than to benefit it. This is mainly because modern automotive production chains are complex international systems where parts are manufactured and assembled all over the world, and a sharp increase in import duties on components will inevitably hit production costs.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
At the very beginning of 2021, quiet conversations, almost whispers, could be heard in the corridors of Detroit. Workers and managers exchanged anxious glances, discussing the first signs of a looming storm. Officially, Ford and other automakers were in no hurry to spread panic, but within the company, they already understood that the tariffs imposed as part of the trade war with China and Mexico could deal a serious blow to the plant. The same factories where legendary models such as the Ford Explorer, Lincoln Aviator, and Bronco had been assembled for decades were on the verge of shutdown. The strategy was clear: reduce dependence on imported parts, move production to the US, and support American workers. But implementing this idea proved not only costly but also extremely difficult. Many parts and components simply cannot be quickly transferred or replaced, as supply chains have been built up over decades and optimized to reduce costs.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The situation became critical in May 2022, when Ford officially announced the temporary suspension of operations at several plants. One of the most high-profile closures was the Chicago plant, the heart of production for popular models manufactured in huge volumes. The lines there came to a halt, and thousands of workers were told they were being laid off. Go home, wait for a call, we don't know when it will be. For many, it came as a shock. Some had worked at these plants for decades, building careers and supporting families. Now their fate was in the hands of an unknown future. A similar situation occurred in Michigan, where assembly of the Bronco and Ranger was also suspended. These decisions were not temporary mistakes, but the first steps toward curbing financial losses caused by higher vehicle costs due to new tariffs.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The problem was not only production stoppages, but also financial losses. According to preliminary estimates, Ford alone could lose more than $1.5 billion by 2025 due to increased costs. This amount is a serious blow to any company, even one as large as Ford, where annual revenues are in the tens of billions. Emergency meetings were held within the corporation, where executives tried to find solutions: how to cut costs, how to retain workers, how not to lose the market. One of the ways was to raise car prices, especially for those assembled in Mexico, to offset the additional duty. As a result, the price of the Mustang Mach-E, Maverick, and Bronco Sport rose by almost $2,000, causing a sharp drop in demand and customer dissatisfaction. But the worst thing was that these tariffs hit not only Ford itself, but the entire automotive industry in the country. Other major players, such as General Motors and Stellantis, the parent company of Chrysler and Dodge, also felt the pressure. GM was forced to restructure its production lines, lay off hundreds of employees, and return part of its production to the United States to avoid additional tariffs. Stellantis completely shut down its plants in Canada and Mexico, triggering a wave of layoffs, including at plants in the US that were involved in component manufacturing. These weren't just numbers and statistics. Thousands of people living in cities in Michigan and Indiana lost their jobs overnight. Production lines that had been buzzing with activity just a short time ago suddenly fell silent. Factories became ghost towns, and economic hardship set in cities where these factories were the main employer. Small businesses that depended on factory workers' incomes, cafes, shops, service stations began to close one after another. State authorities tried to hold emergency meetings and even asked Washington to review its tariff policy, But the Trump administration remained unmoved. According to the White House, tariffs are America first, and short-term economic losses are worth the long-term benefits.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
In response to the pressure, Ford began to urgently change its pricing policy, offer discounts to employees, and look for ways to maintain sales. But even these measures could not fully offset the blow. Rising prices caused a slowdown in demand, with customers postponing purchases for fear of further increases. Dealers faced falling revenues and growing inventories of unsold goods. Moreover, Ford was forced to completely halt exports of its vehicles to China, one of the world's largest automotive markets. This decision was dictated by rising tariffs and the inability to compete with local manufacturers due to increased costs. At the same time, President Trump did not change his position. When asked by reporters about the situation with Ford and the production stoppages, he calmly stated that this was to be expected and that companies should have moved production back to the US long ago. These tariffs are about America, about workers, and about the future, he said, showing no sympathy for the losses of workers and companies. His words only heightened the anxiety and uncertainty in the industry. Every statement from the administration signaled to the markets that the policy would not change and that companies would have to either adapt or face even more serious consequences. In the end, the first 2 points of our plan paint a picture of a serious economic crisis caused by tariff policy. It not only shook the symbols of American industry, Ford and GM factories, but also threw thousands of workers into panic, threatened the economies of entire regions, and called into question the future of the country's entire automotive industry. All this at a time when the global market is becoming increasingly competitive and international trade relations are becoming increasingly tense. At first glance, tariffs were supposed to protect and strengthen national industry. In reality, however, they destroyed one of the strongest foundations of the American economy and forced many to ask themselves whether this game was worth the candle.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The crisis that began with the blows to Ford quickly spread throughout the North American automotive industry, affecting not only Detroit but also cities across the Midwest and even neighboring countries. General Motors, one of the largest companies in the industry, found itself at the epicenter. Despite attempts to adapt and preserve jobs, GM was forced to take drastic steps to cope with the new financial realities. Faced with increased tariffs and rising component costs, the company did not simply cut production, it urgently revised its plans for the future. In one of its closed-door meetings, GM's top management discussed the need to reprogram its entire production logistics, including moving some assembly lines back from overseas to Indiana to minimize the impact of tariffs. However, these measures were accompanied by mass layoffs of hundreds of employees and temporary work stoppages at several plants. In particular, factories that had previously been considered bastions of stability suddenly found themselves threatened with closure or shift reductions. GM increased shifts at its Fort Wayne plant to compensate for losses elsewhere, and even hired an additional 200 people. Despite this, the long-term risks did not diminish. Supply chains built up over decades were breaking down under the pressure of new tariffs and increased costs. Internal GM documents leaked to the press pointed to an alarming forecast. If the situation did not change, the company could face a shortage of components and further cuts, including the closure of a number of plants in the US. A similar situation arose at Stellantis, the company that combines Chrysler and Dodge. The management there was forced to temporarily suspend production at plants in Canada and Mexico, areas that had traditionally been an important part of the supply and assembly chain. This measure was a blow not only to foreign subsidiaries, but also to American companies, where parts and component workers were left without jobs. In Michigan and Indiana, hundreds of people were laid off from factories that were directly dependent on Stellantis production in neighboring countries. This wave of layoffs and shutdowns has already turned into a social problem, as real economic decline has begun in regions where there are no alternative jobs. In addition to rising costs, many manufacturers faced problems accessing foreign markets. In response to US tariffs, China imposed its own duties on American cars, leading to a sharp decline in exports. Ford and General Motors were forced to limit deliveries to one of the world's largest car markets, losing billions of dollars and cutting sales. This situation caused alarm among other companies, which began to look for alternative markets and review their export strategies. Some analysts even predicted that if the trade war dragged on, American cars would gradually lose ground on the international stage, giving way to European and Asian competitors. At the same time, workers within the country were increasingly feeling the negative effects. In cities with large factories and manufacturing centers, rising unemployment became a serious problem. In places such as Coquitlam and Toledo, where layoffs had previously been minimal, production lines and workshops were now closing en masse, hitting entire communities hard. Local authorities and trade unions began to appeal to federal and state officials for help, holding emergency meetings and forums. In some states, such as Indiana and Michigan, retraining and job search programs were launched, but the scale of the problems exceeded the capacity of local resources. The situation was exacerbated by the stock market. Car company shares plummeted, reflecting the general negative sentiment among investors and expectations of further deterioration. Analysts warned that if tariffs remained in place, the industry risked losing over 1 million car sales within a year, which would be a serious blow to the economy. Industry experts and economists expressed concerns that the consequences would affect not only the automotive sector directly, but also related industries such as steel suppliers, electronic component manufacturers, logistics companies, and retail chains. Despite growing alarm bells, the Trump administration continued to insist that its tariff policy would remain unchanged. Official representatives claimed that all difficulties were temporary and that companies would eventually adapt by returning production to the US and strengthening the national economy. However, there was a growing sense of hopelessness within the industry, with most players realizing that without significant changes or government support, it would be very difficult to emerge from the crisis. Many firms had already begun to revise their plans to launch new models, cut research and development spending, and postpone investments in production expansion. With trade policy and international relations becoming increasingly tense, the automotive industry found itself at the center of geopolitical battles. China's retaliatory measures, declining demand, and loss of markets have forced companies to tighten internal cost-cutting measures and seek alternative solutions. As a result, for many manufacturers, the choice between optimizing production and preserving jobs has become increasingly painful and often mutually exclusive. The long-term outlook for the industry looks bleak. The destruction of the integrated production system in North America, which has long been one of the most efficient in the world, is leading to a loss of competitive advantage. Relocating production to the US requires not only time and money, but also the creation of new production ecosystems, suppliers, and infrastructure. Companies that fail to adapt to the new realities risk losing their position in the global market, leading to even greater losses and cutbacks. Workers and their families caught in the eye of this storm are wondering how justified all these sacrifices are. While political leaders promise America first, real people are facing wage cuts, job losses, and an uncertain future. In regions where manufacturing has been the main source of income and stability, economic problems are leading to growing social tensions and a decline in quality of life. As a result, the automotive industry, once a symbol of American power and innovation, is now in a state of severe turmoil. All of this raises the question, will it survive this period and recover, or will the tariffs mark the beginning of the end of an era? The answer to this question depends on many factors, including political decisions, the ability of companies to adapt, and the willingness of society to embrace change. For now, the crisis continues, and every day brings new challenges for manufacturers, workers, and the entire US economy.